Hi, I'm Daryl Stickle. I'm the founder of Trust Unlimited.
Hi, I'm Eric Lott. I'm Daryl's co-host.
Welcome to the Imperfect Cafe. This isn't for those who are perfect. It's for the rest of us. Eric, give them a little bit of a blurb about who you are.
Sure. So Daryl and I have been working together for 5-6 years. My professional career is a little bit different. I was a naval officer for 15 years, and then I transitioned out, did my master's, and have been consulting or contracting in some shape or form over the last 20 years. There's been this common thread for me around teams, around performance, around how do we get more, how do we create an environment where people are comfortable and safe and delivering. And that kind of led me to your trust work. And there's a lot of resonance there because I see it now not as the result of, but the thing you can work on to deliver those values.
Right. And you've got a real practical applied focus in the work you do.
I do. For me, if I can't, theory's great, and I do like reading it and absorbing it, but if I can't apply it, I can't grab onto it and do something with it, to me, it definitely holds less value.
Right. And that's where we show up, right? We've got a very practical applied approach to building trust.
And a unique one.
Yeah. So I wrote my doctoral thesis on building trust in hostile environments at Duke, at the business school there. And then I left and went to McKinsey & Company, a big management consulting firm, and spent a couple of years working for McKinsey, really learning how to apply the model that I'd developed. And then I was injured in a car accident in 2001, ended up with post-concussion syndrome, started a little company called Trust Unlimited, and started applying the model for the next 20 years. It's really been a huge part of my life, that devotion to figuring out how to help people better understand what trust is, how it works, and most importantly, how to build it.
Yeah, and I think, as I came along, 6-7 years ago and got to know you, you have your strengths, and there are certain things that hold you back. And so I think there was a natural role for me coming in is to help coordinate, help step into those areas that you really struggle with, and leveraging technology is one of them.
Right. Go figure. I'm imperfect.
We all are, right?
We are, right? And I could be the poster child for that.
Yeah.
And part of the reason we decided to call it the Imperfect Cafe is because we're seeing more and more that leaders can't adopt that mindset of I'm perfect.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a failed strategy, whether you're a parent or a colleague or a leader or, a presidential candidate. You have to be able to acknowledge that you've got flaws.
Yep. Because
that shows everyone else that it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to learn and grow and develop.
Yeah, and I think, it's important to understand that I really believe there's a polarization around those imperfections as well. Like, if I were to ask my family, one of the biggest things, and I say, well, what is one of my flaws? It really is about being impatient, right? Not willing to wait and be patient for things to work itself through, but more for me, which has become my superpowers, how do you step in and shape the outcome, deliver results, make things speed up?
Right.
And that's where I found my success as a consultant, right? Stepping into situations and projects and technology and change and strategy and making things happen when other people were unable to, because maybe they were just too patient to wait for things to happen.
Right. But that can land differently for different folks.
Absolutely.
Right?
You got to be careful.
Yeah, because people interpret the world through stories, and their story may be, Eric's trying to help me, or it may be, get off my ass.
Yeah.
Right?
It's a delicate balance.
It
right?
Really, and the biggest challenge we're seeing for leaders these days is that ability to let go of the things that got them there, and step into the things that could make them great.
Right.
Because the things that made them a great leader 20 years ago are not the same as what makes a great leader today.
There's been so much change. There's so many new pressures, and it's hard to keep track of.
Well, and what I'm trying to get leaders to say is, the things that will make me a great leader 5 years down the road are not the things that make me great now.
Mm-hmm.
And that means I'm going to have to try new things. I'm going to have to explore, develop new skills. I'm going to have to make mistakes. Right? The mantra that I want them to have is, I'm going to be learning and growing and developing. I will stumble. I may fall. And my expectation is that you're going to be there, providing me with support and helping me learn from those mistakes, because that's exactly what I'm going to do for you.
Right.
At the pace we're at right now, people can't be passive.
Yeah.
The world's moving too fast.
I think it's important that we kind of flip two sides. One is, I'm going to help kind of keep the podcast structured and keep things flowing, because as you can see, Daryl and I can just start talking and we can lose ourselves. So one of the parts here in this first inaugural podcast is to really let the listeners get to know you. And you've got a really deep story that you talk about in the book.
Right.
And I think it's worth talking a little bit about that and how Trust Unlimited came out of that and why you're doing what you're doing.
Right. And that story, actually reflects how I became someone who thinks about trust the way that I do. Right. And it's like, I'm not going to throw around a lot of quotes, but Kierkegaard says that life makes sense in reverse.
Right.
And so I was born and raised in a small town, Fort St. John, northeastern British Columbia. And winters were pretty harsh.
Right.
And it was an isolated community. There were about 12 to 15,000 people there when I grew up.
Mm.
And it was not unusual for it to be minus 40, and so you had to actually pull together. People had to help each other. We had to work as a community. And it didn't mean that everyone was nice and friendly and all that kind of stuff. I mean, many of them were, but there was this sense that we needed each other to survive.
Going to school in January and February with that kind of temperature, there's added challenges with that.
Yeah, it was dark when you went to school. It was dark when you went home. So sun didn't come up till 11 or 12 and went down by 2.
Mm.
And so in that environment, I really developed the mindset of, if you can help people, you should.
Right.
And, I was relatively smart. And so I would help other students. And that was just part of who I was, right? And I had an older brother who protected me and allowed me to be kind of mouthy, right? And a little out of control at times.
Fair enough.
And if I saw somebody bullying someone, I hated it. It allowed me to stand up for that person, right? And say, yeah, I'm standing beneath the shadow of my big brother, right? And so I grew up with that mindset. And then hockey was a huge part of the culture in Fort St. John.
Mm.
And I was playing junior hockey when I was 17, and we went to Fort Nelson to play in a tournament, and I got attacked by a fan with a club.
Mm. How does that happen, right?
It's just crazy. And, 20 years later, I was at the high school reunion, and guys are coming up to me saying, craziest thing I ever saw. Right. And it was videotaped. Like, they were filming it and broadcasting it locally. And so I got to see it later.
Ouch.
And there's this break in the glass where the gate is. And so this guy's standing there, and he reaches out and grabs me, pulls me back against the boards, and he's got a club in his hand. He shatters my helmet. And apparently I'm draped over the boards, and he's just wailing on me. And one of my teammates comes and grabs me and pulls me out of the crowd and pushes me away, and then one of their players grabs me, and a huge brawl breaks out.
Mm.
And our team was younger than their team. We were a juvenile team, so 16 and 17, 18-year-olds.
Right.
And they were up to 21.
Uh-huh.
And they had more players than we did. But the bench cleared.
Right.
They saw this happening to me, and the bench clears. And there are fights going on all over the place. And this other player has me by the hair, and all I can remember is my coach saying, "Turtle, you got to turtle," because we had fewer players. They were trying to fight us out of the game, try to get us so we had too few players to continue.
Right.
And so he had said to us, if a fight comes up, you just got to turtle. And so I'm down on the ice, and this guy's got me by the hair, and he's trying to slam my head into the ice. And he starts kicking me with his skates on. And then he starts gouging my eye, trying to get my face turned. And at that point, there's a bunch of their players standing around us and preventing my team from getting in there and breaking up. And one of the bigger guys on my team steps in, grabs the ref, and throws him on top of us and says, "Break it up." And then a massive brawl erupts. I end up being taken to hospital by ambulance. According to one of my teammates, I stopped breathing 3 times on the way to the hospital.
And you're 17.
I'm 17 years old.
Wow.
And I ended up spending the night in the hospital, spending a couple nights in the hospital. The RCMP were posted outside my door because they were concerned that someone was going to come and attack me.
Over a hockey game.
Over a hockey game. And we were winning, and I was the team captain.
Right.
So that seemed to be the reason. And that led to a really profound concussion.
I bet.
Not surprisingly.
Yeah.
It was the mid-'80s, though, and we didn't know about concussions.
Concussions are treated very differently today.
Yeah. And I'm legally blind. At the time, I had more vision than I do now, but I knew I was losing my sight.
Okay.
And I had realized that for me to be able to be independent and provide for myself, I'd have to train myself to think for a living.
Right. Relying on your brain.
Relying on my brain.
Yeah.
And now all of a sudden it didn't work.
Right. Because of the concussion.
You're right. And so I've got the attention span of a fruit fly. I'm sitting in class and I go from being on the honor roll to failing everything.
Right. The personal struggle at that moment, right? Realizing you've got a lot of healing to do. The thing you have to rely on isn't working.
Right. And I don't know if it's ever going to.
And the doubt, the uncertainty,
the terror.
Right.
Right. The feeling of helplessness and hopelessness.
Right. How long did that last?
2 years.
2 years.
Wow. And I kept getting more concussions because I went and played college hockey after that. We didn't know much about concussions.
Right.
So I had 6 or 8.
Couldn't stop what was in your success.
It was a big part of who I was.
Yeah.
And I played for Grand Prairie's college team. I only played half the season because I kept getting knocked out, but I still led the team in scoring.
Right.
And so I was good at that, but in the meantime, I couldn't pay attention in class. I was sleeping all the time.
Right.
And now they're starting to say, "Wow, you're having a lot of fatigue. Maybe you've got mono.
Right.
Maybe you've got AIDS.
Right.
We're going to test you for leukemia because that's a big
They're
problem."
looking for solutions.
Looking for solutions, and it's just this roller coaster of, wow, maybe something's really wrong.
Right. So again, more uncertainty about your future.
And it provoked this sense of empathy,
right,
in me for people who are really struggling.
Okay. Interesting that you didn't focus that inward and you were able to develop that outward look.
Yeah. I mean, it was a hard journey. And, sometimes a hard road's a good teacher.
Right.
And if we can learn the lessons that it has for us, and it gave me a level of resilience.
Mm-hmm.
It gave me this notion that I'm going to control what I can control.
Okay.
And for some reason, that empathy just seemed to really translate.
Okay.
It seemed to come out because I failed the first 2 years of college. I transferred to the University of Victoria.
Right.
And I don't know why they decided to accept me. Initially, they rejected me because my grades were too poor. Right. I wrote them a letter explaining what had happened, and they let me in.
Oh, wow.
And I failed everything the first year.
Right.
When I was here at UVic. But I'd be sitting on the bus, and people would just sit down next to me and say, "I'm really having a hard time." And I started to wonder, what is it that's driving that? What is it that's making people open up to me?
Right.
Want to connect with me?
And your vision at this point is just slowly declining?
Yeah.
But you're still functioning in society without...
Yeah, so I'm managing. I haven't quite crossed the threshold of being legally blind yet, but I'm getting really close.
Okay.
I can't see chalkboards or overheads.
Right. It's great in a classroom.
Yeah, exactly.
Everything's relying on you being able to see.
slowly I start to recover, and my memory starts to come back, and my ability to function starts to improve.
Okay.
And I switch into psychology.
Okay.
Because I think if this is going to be happening to me, people are going to open up. I should probably try to figure this out.
Right.
And maybe this is a sign that this is the kind of work I'm supposed to do. And so I start working with kids in crisis, families that are struggling, street kids. I start working on crisis lines. All of these things to make myself better at understanding how to help folks who are in turmoil, who are struggling.
Yeah.
And that experience is driving a deeper and deeper understanding.
Okay.
And it's allowing me to have insights.
Yeah.
And partway through it, I realized, a lot of the families I'm working with, they're just doing the best they can. You can see a path forward for them, but they can't take the steps. It's taking them years to become as dysfunctional as they are.
Right.
It's going to take them years to get better.
Yeah.
And so I transitioned into public administration.
Okay.
And I'm working in native land claims.
Where in British Columbia? Still in Victoria?
Still in Victoria. And it's one of the last places on earth that hasn't settled Indigenous claims, right?
Yeah.
And so they would ask me these deep philosophical questions like, what is self-government? Or what will BC look like 50 years after claims are settled? The last question was, how do we convince a group of people we've shafted for over 100 years they should trust us?
It's a tough question.
That's a good question, right? And so it had me start to think about, not just the native land claim situation and the struggle we have with the Indigenous populations, but long-term disputes we see all over the place.
Yeah.
Right? The Middle East,
Ireland,
China and Taiwan.
Yeah.
Republicans and Democrats in the U.S.
Republicans and Democrats.
And so we see these disputes, and we seem to do a really poor job of resolving them.
Yeah.
And they seem to last well after they do anyone any good, if they ever did.
Right.
And so I started to get really curious about that. And I applied and got accepted to do my PhD at Duke at the business school.
Okay.
And
you're deciding to study this.
I'm deciding this is the path I'm going to follow.
Okay.
And I decide I'm going to write my doctoral thesis on building trust in hostile environments.
Okay.
And, if you believe in fate, one of the world's leading academics on the topic of trust is a guy named Sim Sitkin. He shows up the same year I do. He transfers from Texas.
He comes to Duke.
And he's at the business school.
Nice.
The year after I show up, a woman named Karen Cook shows up in the sociology department. She's one of the other leading experts on the topic of trust in academia.
Excellent.
And so they both end up on my committee. And as I'm going through this, I'm starting to have these sort of insights around the work that I had done before, the work I'd done with families, the experiences I'd had. And I'm looking at all the trust literature, and I come to realize that most of it's just focusing on uncertainty.
Right.
And mostly it's just that individual piece of uncertainty that it's focusing on.
Okay.
And I'm thinking the definition is a willingness to be vulnerable when you can't predict how someone else is going to behave.
So
Where's the vulnerability?
That was the definition when you were studying your PhD that you landed on?
Yeah, it was. It was one that was put forward in 1995 by a guy named Roger Mayer, a good friend of mine.
Okay.
And it seemed to be generally accepted for most of the field. And so that definition has elements of uncertainty and vulnerability in it.
Mm-hmm.
And so it had me thinking, well, does uncertainty just come from us?
Right.
No, it comes from us in the context, right?
Sure.
So how do we trust people without knowing anything about them?
Why?
Why, right?
Yeah.
You go to a doctor's office, you get in a cab, you get on an airplane. You're trusting someone without knowing anything about them.
Right.
As an individual.
Yeah.
And so that was one piece that sort of was different. And then the inclusion of vulnerability. So most of the trust literature treats trust like a dichotomous variable, right? Like it's either present,
variable, like on or off?
On or off, like an old-time light switch, right?
Yeah.
It's I either trust someone or I don't.
Yeah.
And And often that's where our heads go, but the reality is we trust some people more than others. Right?
Sure.
And so we didn't have a good way of explaining depth of relationship and why we trust some people more than we trust other people.
Right.
And then after that trust decision, what happens? Right? Do we treat it as a single play? Like I meet you and I either trust you or I don't, and then we never experience each other again?
Light switch again.
Right.
On or off.
Right.
Yeah.
But you and I have engagements all the time. We interact and we interact with people who we're familiar with. You go to the grocery store, you see the teller that you're familiar with.
Yeah.
And so there's actually a loop that's going on here.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have to have room for perceived outcomes. Right? My impression of how this goes has an impact on how I think about our next exchange.
Next time. Right.
And in the middle of all this is our emotional states, whether we like or dislike someone else.
Right.
And again, 99% of the trust literature treats people like they're rational actors. You've met people, right?
Yeah. Rationality isn't always at the top of the list.
Not always. And the more emotional we become, the less rational we are.
Right. And under stress in those situations where you really wish you could be rational, you're not.
Right. And you look back and you think, man, I didn't handle that the way I would have.
Yeah, I would have loved to say that different.
Can I get a mulligan?
Yeah.
And so without that, we don't understand why these hostile environments exist, why these conflicts persist.
Right.
Why groups of people can say, why can't you just see the logic and the reason behind this? Mm-hmm. And we're trying these rational actor approaches to building trust in a profoundly emotional environment.
Right. Oh, that's quite the story. That's quite the history. And it is the kind of the crucible, right?
It is. And I gotta tell you, when I finished, Sim and Karen, my two co-chairs on my committee, sat down with me and they said, okay, you first came to us with this. We said, no way he solves it. Too big, too complicated. We'll give him 6 months.
Right.
And then he'll come crawling back and we'll let him chisel off a little piece of that and that'll be his thesis. They said 6 months in, you were so far beyond us, we couldn't help anymore.
Right.
And here we are at the end. We think you've solved it.
Wow.
And so.
And that was how long ago?
That was in 1999.
99. Okay.
Yeah. 24 years ago.
24.
And then I went to work for McKinsey.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And they said, wow, you've got good client hands. Let's send you to the worst places possible. And so now I'm getting this practical applied exposure to problem solving and helping clients and all that kind of stuff.
Yep.
And I'm actually getting to apply the model.
In your engagements?
In my engagements. So I'm sent to a client site where there's been labor disputes and firings and strikes and violence. And I get sent in to try to help solve this problem.
Right. Keep it from happening.
Right. And I do.
Right.
Right. And so I'm starting to gain experience and confidence as I go along. Right. And then in 2001, I get involved in a car accident, another concussion. And this one's, it just stays with me.
Right.
Right. Like I struggle with fatigue. I have moments where I struggle with concentration and memory and those kinds of things.
Right.
And so for a couple of years, I'm just completely gone.
Okay.
And struggling to kind of get back on my feet and
again, rehabilitating your brain.
Rehabilitating and dealing with insurance companies who are not trying to help. And then one of my old colleagues from McKinsey reaches out to me and says, hey, just come give a talk. Just come talk to us.
Right.
And he says, talk about sustainable competitive advantage.
Mm-hmm.
So he's
head of the audience set up.
Yeah, so he's working for a mutual fund company.
Okay.
And he's head of strategy.
Yeah. And
they're having this retreat.
Okay. And now you're going to come in and talk about it. I'm
going to come in and be one of the speakers.
Right.
And so there's several hundred people sitting in the audience.
Yeah.
And I said, sustainable competitive advantage means you do something better than your competitors that they can't copy.
Right.
I said, you don't do anything I can't copy. I could buy one share of every fund you have, and now I know how they're all built. I could I sell what you sell at a discount because I don't have to pay the fund advisor.
Right.
And the CEO was sitting there, and he looked like he'd been hit in the forehead with a sledgehammer.
Hmm.
I said, the only thing you could do is build deep, long-term relationships with your customers because that's hard to copy.
Right.
And they went, that's it. That's our strategy.
To build relationships.
To build stronger relationships with their customers who were financial advisors.
Bet you had a hard time selling that at the board.
Well, it was a challenge because that's not the way they had done things traditionally.
I don't think anyone really does that traditionally.
No, it was
Focuses on all the relationships.
right. And so they were focused on flogging product.
Yeah.
And if I've got 10% of your business, I want 11%.
Right.
What if I take you to a hockey game?
Yeah.
Or buy you a nice dinner?
Yeah.
And I come in and I said, how about we change our mindset to try to double the size of our clients? Because you know what? 10% of twice as much is twice as much.
Mm-hmm.
And they kind of went, well, how the hell would we do that? And so now I'm starting to apply the model.
Okay.
And I built a workshop. I trained everybody.
Right.
And so I'm doing coaching.
A lot of sales guys.
A lot of sales guys, some of the marketing folks.
Right. And the marketing and the communications that go along with it.
Yeah.
Everything has to line up.
Even some of the fund advisors and most of the senior executives.
Right.
And I'm talking them through this, and they're saying, well, geez, this sounds great, but how do we know people will buy?
Right.
How do we tell them, hey, you have to pay us for this?
Right.
And I said, you don't need to worry about that. I said, if you double the size of their business, if you actually come in and say, I'm here to help you grow your business.
Right.
Not only will they stick with you, but they'll want to buy more of your product.
Right.
I said, if worse comes to worse, you start to segment your clients basically saying, look, I've got 200 people I serve. If I'm not being helpful to you, let me know because I'll move on and be helpful to somebody else.
Right.
And they went from middle of the pack to dramatically outperforming any of their competitors. And it was during the dot-com bubble bursting.
Okay.
And so
people were
scared.
Absolutely scared. Looking
for a safe harbor.
Safe harbors. Safe places to put their money.
And so after 18 months, they hired Ipsos Reid, a professional survey firm.
Right.
And that firm came back and said, trust is the primary driver of the sales decision.
Okay.
And you're dramatically more trusted than any of your competitors.
Wow.
And they then generated 75 cents of every new dollar that came into the industry for the next 2 years.
Okay.
And they were part of a global financial services organization. That organization started sending teams from all over the world to figure out what they were doing because they were dominating.
Wow.
And so from that, I realized what I have works. It's not perfect,
right,
but it works. And then I spent the next 20 years helping people solve trust problems.
Okay.
And learning the whole way through.
Right.
Right? And so every time I work with a client, I learn something new. You and I worked with a client on Monday.
Yep, we sure did.
And I learned new things on Monday.
I think there's layers to the model as I've become more and more intimate with it and working with clients with you. It's definitely interesting. And it's interesting that, it's taken, since 1999 and really the existing kind of professional work in the consultant and the business world around trust seems to be way behind still.
It's stagnant.
It's just not moving forward. And so when I first got introduced to your model, the first thing that was, jumped out at me is, this is very practical and applied. I can learn a set of skills in a very narrow or a very broad setting and apply them around individual relationships, around how a team might work, or how I might communicate to an organization or step into change within an organization. So pretty powerful.
Yeah, well, there's been a real evolution as we've gone along.
Yep.
So initially it was really, I was learning more about trust and how it worked.
Right.
And then as I started working with the mutual fund company, I started to learn more about how to communicate that in a way that was simple and people could get it.
Yeah.
And over the next 20 years, that learning curve just continued for me. But now it's more of a focus on how do we help people actually change behavior patterns?
Okay.
And how do we make it so that this stuff lands?
Yeah.
And so much of the trust stuff that we see in the world really focuses on us as individuals. It focuses on kind of 3 of the 10 levers that we talk about.
Right.
But even when it focuses on those 3 levers, it doesn't tell you how to pull them.
No, it's very kind of value fluffy oriented, as
Right.
opposed to if I want to show something like ability or benevolence, how would I go about demonstrating that?
Right. And so you've laid out 2 of the levers, right? So
Yep.
the 3 levers that are most common are benevolence, integrity, and ability.
Yeah.
And those are the ones that people talk about the most. But our client on Monday, we were talking to them about benevolence and how that could help them shield them.
Yeah, how they
Shocks.
and become resilient and have each other's backs.
And they looked at us and they said, okay, that sounds great. How do we do that?
Yeah.
And we had to start role modeling for them. And they've learned that it's okay to ask us that question.
Yeah.
That we're going to have examples, that we're going to be problem solving with them about how do you actually do this. That's why we wrote the book.
Well, that's it. And, it was very quickly we developed a very simple practice for the team who had gone through the model and done a bunch of learning already and had applied it in some specific relationships, but weren't necessarily thinking about how do I apply this in a team environment or an organizational environment.
Right.
And now they need to kind of say, well, how can I do that? And so we talk about benevolence from a different perspective, about how as a team you can show up for each other and support each other, even if we're not all present or if we're doing something with an external client or an external stakeholder. So,
and that conversation around benevolence cues me to why are we doing the podcast?
Yeah, it's a good one because I know. So, yeah, we've got to talk to our listeners a little bit about what they can expect from us.
Yeah.
And we've got two different types of formats that we're going to try to engage with as we go through that. So, why don't you first start with that? What can they expect?
So they can expect us to try to be very practical and applied, talking about leadership and trust and how to get better at that. And as a listener, you can expect us to try to have your best interest at heart. And for us to do that effectively, we're going to need you to tell us what you need, what good looks like, what success looks like for you, how we can help you get there. And so we're going to be focused on trying to raise awareness about trust, raise awareness about what good leadership looks like, and give you practical applied tools for how to improve your batting average, to get better at building stronger relationships.
I love that baseball analogy when you use your batting average. Your oldest son is a big baseball fan.
Right.
And you have become one as well. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that batting average is, I think, something we talk about over and over again is that you can't always be there to pull the levers and have them land, but the better we get at applying little things and putting that into our practice and into our toolkit, the more often it's going to land. And the more often we swing the bat and connect, the more likely we're about to get on base. And so that batting average is important.
It really is. And you and I both know everyone has the ability to build trust.
Yep.
Some are just better than others.
Yeah.
And those who aren't very good have a lever that they pull.
Yeah.
And they pull it over and over again and hope it lights up.
Right. It's a perfect piece, right? Like for me, I was in places trying to make change, trying to deliver results. And so I pulled the integrity lever. It was just natural for me,
Yeah,
right?
it's good for
I did what I said. And I followed through on it. So I would be very consistent, almost pedantic at times, and really talk about everything that we were doing and where we were making headway and how we were achieving it. And just over and over again, against whatever influence was coming at it, we would make progress. And then once people start buying into the progress and start understanding it, things the friction would disappear, right? And then once that friction starts dissolving, you have this real opportunity to really kind of push through a program of change or implement or restructure and people get on board. But in the beginning, it's like fog of war, right? You're trying to move forward and you don't know if you're making any progress.
Right. And so integrity is a powerful lever.
Yeah.
And we see it not being well used in multiple leadership settings.
Yeah.
ability is another one that people love to use, right? I have these kinds of credentials, this background, this much experience.
Yeah.
So those who aren't very good have a lever.
Yeah.
Those who are better have multiple levers.
Right.
Those who are really good have multiple levers and they know when to pull which one.
Mm.
And so really the focus of our work is making people aware of the 10 different levers that we talk about.
Yeah.
And then showing them how to pull them so that they get practice.
Yeah.
And that's been a real transition for us.
Yep.
In some of the learning that we do, because so much of learning and development is fire and forget. I tell people something and then I walk away.
Yeah.
And maybe they implement it, maybe they don't.
Yeah.
Maybe they understood it, maybe they didn't.
Yeah.
And what we really try to do is small doses of information followed with practice something.
Yeah.
Here's a skill to practice.
Well, it's a little, you go back to the baseball analogy, right? It's the theory says, oh, here's your bat, and this is what a ball does, and this is where the diamond is, but it never actually puts you up there and gets you to swing the bat to try to hit the ball, right?
Yeah.
And if you don't do that, you're never going to learn how to do it and how to bring it into muscle memory.
Right.
And so swinging the bat and giving in your individual coaching calls, in our group session work, is really focusing on, okay, who swung the bat this week? What did you learn? Right? Who didn't swing the bat? Why didn't you swing the bat? How can we help you get there? It's okay if you don't feel comfortable yet. How do we reduce the barrier for you to then step up to the plate and grab the bat and take a swing?
Yeah. Well, and part of the challenge that we face sometimes is people think, oh my God, the trust guys are here. There's going to be singing. We're going to hold hands, blindfolds, fall off of things.
Trust falls.
We don't do that.
Yeah.
We actually get you to have conversations, to practice pulling these levers, to think about empathy, to think about how do I connect with someone in a way that really lands.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we want for you, because we've had some remarkable successes.
Yeah.
We've had some incredibly powerful moments. But we're trying to get the signal through the
noise. I think that's the struggle that, since coming on board with you, is just realizing that the status quo around the concept and the theory is so thick that I haven't been able to break through. And that's where, I'm hoping with all the great support we have and the people working with us, that we're going to start breaking through and people are going to start hearing what we have to say and what you have to offer.
Yeah.
And allow people to bring into their daily practice, whether it's at home or at work or in a community, to start really, understanding the model and applying the model and be better at building trust and deepening your relationships.
And it's such a powerful time to be doing that.
Yeah.
Trust levels are the lowest we've seen.
Yeah.
And we've got these sort of wicked problems, these big, hairy problems that are facing us, things like climate change and race relations and gender inequality or conflict, polarization of different sides of the political spectrum, pandemics. All of these things require us to work together. They require collective collaborative action for us to solve them.
Yeah.
And our trust levels are the lowest we've ever seen.
Really hard to collaborate together when you don't trust.
It's impossible.
Yeah.
And, when we don't give each other the benefit of the doubt, when we don't have a positive narrative about each other, it just makes these exchanges fraught with challenge, and it feels like we're all walking on eggshells.
Right. So the purpose of the podcast, to kind of rephrase or to summarize, is really to give the learners a chance to hear how the experiences we're having as we apply the model, some of the learning that is being presented. It's not there to replace the actual learning itself, but to give you the contextual information so that you're more comfortable, you can enjoy it and see where you might be interested in stepping in.
We're trying to reduce your uncertainty.
Yeah.
We're trying to make it easier for you to say, this is a place where I should invest some time and energy. And for me, the goal is no less than making the world a better place. I've got 2 sons that are the center of my life. I want the world to be a better place for them.
Right. The last point before we put a pause on, There's going to be kind of two formats going forward, not counting this one. This was more introductory. There's going to be a coaching format and then an interview subject matter expert format. Can you talk a little bit about what's the different intentions there?
Yeah, so we want to be able to have people see me actually coaching someone so that they can see how the model applies, how I apply the model to different problems. And I'm going to ask you to help us by sending us questions and suggestions for topics you'd like us to discuss. And the experts, we're going to bring in people who are leaders or theoretical experts on different topics or people who are having an impact in the world,
right?
And talk with them about their perspectives on leadership and trust and how it aligns with the values that we're expressing, the model that we've articulated.
Yeah, there's so many people talking about it, right? It may be in thin slices, but there's still, big advocates out there in the business world, in the influencer world, talking about trust,
right,
talking about leadership, talking about relationships, talking about emotional intelligence, perspective taking. There are some great works that we don't pretend to own the theory of all of those different components,
right,
but we definitely borrow from them, and we're going to, share the praises for a lot of that foundational work, and how it relates to trust is our unique element, how it fits with the framework.
Yeah, so we try to provide a framework that slots some of those other theories so that people know when to apply them.
Yeah.
And also gives people a better ability to interpret the world.
Yeah.
And the focus for us is really around helping people solve their own problems, having a framework to allow them to diagnose the problem and helping them figure out how to solve it themselves.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Well, we're going to take a pause and then we're going to get into the next part of this podcast.